So it is a few minutes past 1, so I think we can start with the webinar, and as people come, we can just admit them to the webinar. We have already 28 participants, so let's start. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, The Outlook of Rural Businesses and the Impact from COVID-19. My name is Lisel Hernandez. I am a postdoctoral fellow working with the Rural Ontario Institute in partnership with the University of Guelph. Today, we'll hear from 3 representatives of the Center for Special Business Projects in Statistics Canada, Andrew Balcom, Haaris Jafri, and Marina Smailes. They will share with us some key data to better understand the impacts of the ongoing pandemic on rural businesses across Canada, with a focus on rural Ontario. Thank you, Andrew, Haaris, and Marina for sharing this important information with us today. And to all the participants that are here today, thank you for joining us. I'm sure you'll find this webinar useful and relevant for your own work. A few housekeeping issues before starting. The webinar is being recorded. The recording will be posted on the ROI website, so you can rewatch it or share it with your colleagues if you want to. We will start with presentations from our speakers, then we'll open the floor for questions. You can use the chat to write your questions, or you can unmute your mics and interact with the speakers. The webinar is 1 hour long. If we run out of time and you still have questions, please write them in the chat together with your contact information. We'll share this with the presenters and they'll reach out to you with an answer. I see that some people are still joining, so in a few minutes, can we start with a quick poll? It is only one question. We would like to know what type of organization you are representing. So you should be seeing the poll right now in your screens. And we are seeing it is moving 30%, 40% non-for-profits. So we have 40% non-for-profits, 20% local government, and we have businesses, we have university or colleges, some economic development organizations. Yeah, thank you very much. So I think everybody answered. Thank you, everybody. So we have, as I mentioned it, 42% nonprofits, 23% local government, and the rest of the participants come from businesses, provincial or federal government, universities or colleges, and economic development organizations. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And yeah, so now to the presenters, if we want to start with your presentations, please.
Hello, thank you very much, Lisel, for the introduction. So my name is Haaris Jafri, and I have with me my colleagues, Marina Smailes and Andrew Balcom, who will be co-presenting with me. So we'll be looking at the outlook for rural businesses amid the pandemic, and the results that we will be sharing today are based on the Canadian Survey of Business Conditions division undertakes every quarter. Slide, please. Can we have the next slide, please? Thank you, Marina. So just a little sort of, context here, we are all aware that businesses have felt unprecedented impacts during the pandemic. We know of many closures and other sort of hardships that businesses have been suffering. So these have varied by province or territory, whether the business was located in urban or rural areas, by industry and by business size. And that's kind of what our survey results are showing us, and that's what we'll be sharing with the audience today. So I'll just give a bit of a background on the Canadian Survey on Business Conditions, which is CSBC for short. It is a quarterly survey that was initiated by our division, which is the CSBP, which is the Center for Special Business Projects, different from CSBC. Just wanted to sort of make that clarification so as not to confuse the two acronyms there. In March of last year, to assess the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on businesses. So the results, so we are publishing tables, and we are also publishing analyses based on the CSBC survey. And the analyses go in the series known as the StatCan COVID-19 Data Insights for a Better Canada series, which is linked through the daily when it's released. So I'll just go into a few of the features of the CSBC, just to as a sort of background into what the survey is all about. So each quarter, so it's a quarterly survey, and each quarter has a different set of questions, and there's some overlap of themes and questions. And the changes are, to accommodate the needs of stakeholders as they come on board. We have different departments, other stakeholders who are in touch with us, and they come and tell us about their priorities. So that's one reason. And the other reason is the sort of the evolution or the progression of the pandemic, and as things sort of change, evolve, the questions sort of change to reflect or to capture the current, sort of the most important sort of aspects to understand at that time. So the sample size of the survey has been growing. The third quarter of this year, 2021, has a sample of 17,000 employer businesses, of which about 4,000 are rural businesses. And responding to the survey is voluntary. And the survey is sample design is a stratified random sample classified by geography, industry sector, and size. So we can have estimates for all three of those dimensions. I'll just sort of mention a few of the type of questions that the CSBC contains, just to set the stage, and then Marina and Andrew will be presenting the results that we've been seeing in the past 2 quarters. So there are questions on activities of the businesses, for example, whether they import, export, whether they invest outside Canada. There are questions on expectations of the businesses over the next 3 months, what obstacles, what changes they expect. Then there are questions on expectations of the next 12 months, whether they anticipate selling, closing, restructuring. And then there are a bunch of other questions, such as on digital ordering, PPE. I suppose like everybody knows what PPE stands for right now, but a year ago, maybe not many of us might have known. And then like credit or funding, government support programs they utilize, teleworking, and future outlook. So basically, the CSBC provides a rural lens on businesses. I mean, that's not the primary sort of purpose of it, but it has enough power or to sort of be able to provide results by industry and by province for the most part at that level. And so rural data are being emphasized at StatScan right now, and it's identified as a priority area, and our division is kind of leading that project at the moment. So what is rural? There are a number of definitions. I think I don't have to go into that. The definition that we are using is any areas outside of CMAs and CAs. And also just want to mention that obviously there are degrees of rurality that are determined by a number of factors that are at play there. So there's no like black and white rural versus urban. There's like rural, more rural, a bit less rural. And some of the factors that play a role there are remoteness from and commuting patterns to larger centers, population and density. So higher population, higher density is usually urban areas. Demographic profile, that might be the age sort of makeup of the population. You might not have as many younger people in rural areas as they move to urban areas for employment opportunities and other reasons, education. Other differences might be in infrastructure. You might have a sparse infrastructure in rural areas. Accessibility might be an issue where there are maybe seasonal roads, or maybe some are like fly-in communities and things of that nature. So I'll pass it on to Marina now, who will sort of take it from here to present some of the results from the CSBC survey. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Art. And just to add, CMAs and CAs are the census metropolitan areas and census agglomerations, such as Toronto would be a CMA, for example, and CAs are other slightly smaller cities in general. So we'll be going through the results of the first and second quarter reference period. We'll be focusing a first part on the first quarter and then providing some second quarter contrast. Our paper on the second quarter analysis is coming out this Friday, so we will be publishing that. But the second quarter data for rural urban by province is already available, was published earlier last month, I guess, or actually end of May. So we'll be talking about some of the various highlights that we found in the first quarter and reference to the second quarter as well. So overall, rural businesses were more likely to remain operational than urban businesses. This was a insight generated from the first quarter of 2021. So that was looking back basically at the beginning of the pandemic, coming up into about early January, February of 2021. And the question was asking what type of operation level does your business have? So we found that 43% of rural Ontario businesses were fully operational compared to 32% of urban counterparts. And this follows the same trend that we see nationally, with slightly higher rural full operation compared to urban, although in Ontario there was less full operational ability overall. We saw quite a large difference across Canada by industry. We had the largest positive rural differences where rural businesses were better off in terms of operation status in wholesale trade and administrative and support, waste management and remediation services. We also saw a difference in professional, scientific and technical services and information and cultural industries, where much more or more rural businesses were less able to remain fully operational than their urban counterparts. And this was across Canada. I've shown a breakdown by industry for this across Canada, so it's not Ontario specific. Unfortunately, when we start to go down into by province, rural versus urban, and then by industry, we do start to see a decrease in the data quality. So showing every industry is not always possible, depending on the sample size and response rate that we get, among other things, from survey respondents. But as you can see here, by industry across Canada, we do see a really wide range of ability to remain operational. We can see that arts, entertainment, and recreation businesses and accommodation and food service businesses, only about 1 in 10 were able to remain fully operational during the 2020 portion of the pandemic. And then you can see other businesses were less affected depending on the industry. We also have a look at the operating status of businesses based on Ontario specific rural and urban, and then Canada rural and urban, to give you a little bit more of a sense of what's happening in Ontario. We can see here that overall, rural Ontario businesses were slightly less likely than all Canadian rural businesses to remain fully operational, but they also were a little bit better positioned to remain partially operational. And in general, both across Canada and in Ontario, rural businesses were able to remain at least fully or partially operational, more likely than their urban counterparts. We do see, though, that in rural Ontario, there were more businesses that were shut down temporarily and remained shut down for a period of time. So that is kind of an extended, not closure necessarily, not permanent closure, but an extended closure, which may affect their businesses. Rural businesses were also found to have smaller revenue declines than urban businesses, comparing 2019 to 2020. Urban businesses across Canada were more likely to lose 10% of their revenue or more than 10% of their revenue, except in the arts, entertainment, and recreation, and finance and insurance industries. In particular, we noticed a couple areas where rural businesses were really shining in comparison to urban businesses. In wholesale trade, 30% of rural businesses had revenue losses greater than 10%, which compared to almost 60% of urban businesses in that industry. And we had similar large differences between rural businesses and urban businesses in retail trade and administrative and support, waste management, and remediation services. It's such a long industry to say. But so we did see some really large differences in those three industries. Looking at it, but at the Canada, rural, Ontario, rural, urban breakdown, we do see overall that rural Ontario businesses were slightly more likely to have larger revenue decreases between the 2 years than overall rural businesses in Canada. But again, they were still better off than their urban Ontario counterparts. Although the chart here does show there's just a couple differences in percentage points, so that the figures are fairly small. We have in the blue here 10% to less than 30% revenue decrease, then 30% to less than 50% revenue decrease, and then 50% or more. So we can see the gray bar in the Ontario rural section is a bit higher than Canada rural overall. I'll go to the next slide. Andrew.
Thanks, Marina. So now we look at plans to sell, close, or transfer businesses. And this comes from a question that was repeated across the first quarter and second quarter iterations of the survey. So this allows us to track the changing responses. And when doing so, we see that there was an overall decrease in plans to sell, close, or transfers for both rural and urban businesses, and rural and urban businesses within Ontario and Canada as a whole. The largest decrease across 2 quarters was seen in rural Ontario businesses, where there was a drop from 9.1% of businesses planning to sell, close, or transfer, and which decreased down to 6.2% in the second quarter. In general, there was greater difference between rural and urban businesses than for Ontario and Canadian businesses. So here we see a chart with those results. In the orange lines are Ontario and blue is Canada. And we have the rural urban breakdown and the first and second quarter stacked. So the very first orange line, we see the rural Ontario first quarter, and we see that it was significantly the largest, although Canadian rural was also very large. And we see those decrease once we go to the from top to bottom, the third cluster in the second quarter, both decreased to quite similar sizes. And we see a decrease across all variations within the chart.
So online sales became a lot more relevant during the pandemic in terms of businesses trying to pivot when they were partially or fully closed down, especially in Ontario, where we had some full shutdown of certain businesses over extended periods of time. And so this chart looks at the percentage of businesses that made at least 30% of their sales online, comparing 2019 and 2020. Overall, rural businesses were in 2019 less likely to have at least 30% of their sales online, and they also didn't increase as much compared to their urban counterparts, both in Ontario and across Canada. And this could be for a variety of reasons. there's different reasons that businesses choose to sell online or not. It could be challenges with pivoting online, such as internet access, reliability, a lot of new infrastructure, potentially paying for new websites and services, back-end services as well. It could also be that they just didn't feel the need to switch to online sales. Either their client base remained the same and we're still ordering regardless of being able to enter the business, for example. So it's not necessarily indicative of, I guess, a loss of sales, but just that pivot to online sales was not as noticeable for rural businesses. This chart looks at the length of time businesses can continue to operate at current levels of revenue and expenditures before considering layoffs. And this is from the first quarter of 2021. And it's broken down into less than 12 months, which is essentially a sign that in the next year, with current levels of revenue expenditure, there may be some concerns. 12 months or more is seen as a generally positive outlook. And then we can also see in the unknown category, which is quite high, a lot of businesses were having trouble predicting, maybe based on fluctuations or perceived future fluctuations in current levels of revenue expenses, or various other concerns such as finding employees or government regulations, insurance, rising cost of inputs, et cetera, which actually Andrew will go on to in the next section. There's a lot of potential reasons why businesses are really uncertain about what their future moves are going to be. But we also do see here when businesses did have some certainty that on the right here in Ontario, there were more businesses in rural Ontario that said they thought they could operate for less than 12 months at their current revenue and expenditures before considering layoffs. So it doesn't mean that it's guaranteed. You can make other changes to your business model before implementing layoffs, but it does show that some businesses are having difficulty with continuing operations at their current levels, and future layoffs may be a consideration they have to take. We can also see here that in Ontario, the urban areas were slightly less likely to say this. And overall, compared to Canada urban, that was a little bit more positive outlook for the, Canadian rural businesses had a slightly more positive outlook when looking at considering layoffs in the next year.
Thanks, Marina. In this section, we'll look at common challenges facing rural Ontario businesses. So we have rural Ontario in the blue, but then Ontario urban and then Canadian, both rural and urban, as points of comparison. And so from our first quarter results, these were the top 4 challenges selected by rural Ontario businesses. In decreasing numbers, supply chain challenges was the most common, followed by rising cost of inputs, fluctuations in consumer demand, and maintaining sufficient cash flow or managing debt. So for the first 2, they were supply chain challenges and rising cost of inputs. Over 50% of rural Ontario businesses selected this challenge as something they were having to deal with. And we can see that they were noticeably higher than their points of comparison. It does appear that the rural angle is important here because, while not quite as high, rural Canada was higher than the Ontario and Canadian urban businesses here. Moving rightwards, we see that fluctuation in consumer demand and maintaining sufficient cash flow or managing debt, on the other hand, were much rural Ontario businesses were facing these challenges at similar rates to their points of comparison. So this was a question that has been posed in both the first and second quarter iterations. So we can again track the changes in responses. So in the second quarter results, the top 4 challenges for rural Ontario businesses was again, rising cost of inputs, difficulty acquiring inputs, products, or supplies domestically, government regulations, and fourthly, cost of insurance. Now, it's important to note here, difficulty acquiring inputs, products, or supplies domestically is awfully similar to supply chain challenges. This is due to the phrasing of the question, which we will address a bit more in our following slide. But we can see here that it's very similar to previously rising cost of inputs. Close to 50% of rural Ontario businesses were dealing with this issue, but the Ontario urban, Canadian rural, and urban businesses were more likely to also deal with these issues. Difficulty acquiring inputs or supplies. Rural Ontario was higher than the points of comparison by about 10% or so. In government, similar for government regulations, rural Ontario slightly higher, but cost of insurance was relatively similar, particularly for rural Ontario and rural Canada. So in this chart, we compare the top 4 challenges across quarters and the responses from rural Ontario businesses for both of them. So moving right to left, the first 4 topics were the top 4 from the first quarter, and then in the second quarter, fluctuations in consumer demand and cash flow and debt were not their top 4 and replaced by government regulations and cost of insurance. But this chart allows us to compare the responses across quarters. So we see that supply chain challenges / difficulty acquiring inputs, products, or supplies domestically. We've compared them here directly. We didn't do so in our paper that is being released on Friday, since they are technically different responses. We can do so here because it's interesting, but it is important to note that the difference in responses could be due to the nuanced differences in the available answers. But we see that there's a fall of over 10%, maybe approximately 13%. On the other hand, rising cost of inputs has remained a problem across both quarters, which is very interesting. For consumer demand and cash flow issues, we see drops of over 10%, approximately 15 maybe, and then close to 10%, showing that these issues have, well, still important, have decreased in ordinal position, and that government regulations and cost of insurance have increased and are now slightly more pressing issues. We see particularly for government regulations that has increased by over 10%. And that concludes our primary presentation. Thank you very much, and I believe we have some questions to follow.
Yes, thank you, Marina, Andrew, and Harris for that informative presentation. Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Petrick, and I'm a data analyst working with the Rural Ontario Institute for the summer. So we will be taking questions if anyone has any. But before we do that, we do have a few preset questions that we'd like to put to our presenters. So there are 3 of them, and if you have questions that you'd like to ask, you can hold off and we will have time for you to unmute your mic later on, or you can put them in the chat and I'll be happy to read them off in a moment as well. So in terms of the questions that we have, the first one for Andrew, Marina, and Harris, as we look ahead to a post-pandemic world, what economic advantages or opportunities do rural businesses have when we compare them with urban ones? And how can rural areas use these to support business development in their areas?
Thank you, Alex. We've seen over the course of analyzing the last few quarters of the survey that rural businesses overall did have smaller decreases in revenue between 2019 and 2020. We also saw that they had a better ability to remain fully operational and also operational to some capacity, whether that's fully operational or partially operational. So kind of looking backwards initially, we do see that rural businesses in general show a bit of resiliency in those aspects, which can help to provide a little bit of a buffer, kind of a bit of a cushion or less severe shutdowns or revenue decreases than urban businesses. And hopefully that can kind of help buffer them going into 2021 and further into 2021. So I think looking back in the 2020 portion of the pandemic, there was signs of resiliency among urban businesses. Obviously, as we moved into 2021, there were some more provincial, especially in Ontario, provincial-wide shutdowns, which did impact businesses. And it's interesting looking at the various time periods that were assessed in the survey. We had the first quarter of 2021, we were asking people questions in early January and February. That was right after an uncertain holiday season, the start of lockdowns in Ontario especially. And so there was a lot of uncertainty about what 2021 would hold. And then for the second quarter, we see that those questions were posed in April and going from early April to early May, which there were more vaccinations happening. We saw a lot of places opening up more or had the possibility of opening up soon in the future. And that kind of optimism, I took a look at some of the Q2 results for rural businesses and did note that rural businesses overall were slightly more optimistic than urban businesses about the future. So I think the sense of optimism is important for businesses, and that kind of resiliency that we see. Rural businesses in general are more able or do not need to take on more debt. So that showcases a certain level of flexibility with changing plans. They also are slightly more likely than urban businesses to foresee their profitability increasing over the next couple of months. And we also saw that they actually stated that they were slightly more optimistic. That was one of the questions. And so in general, I think that rural businesses are moving kind of beyond second quarter of 2021 with a bit more resiliency and a bit more optimism. And I'm very curious to see kind of what those answers are like in the third quarter of 2021, when we can kind of see people are answering those now. The survey is actually opened on July 2nd, and will go until August. So we'll get a sense now with the vaccination rates much higher and opening in Ontario, especially. Hopefully we'll see businesses continue to kind of share those sentiments and look at their future outlook in a positive way. So generally, I think economically, there is that kind of sentiment of optimism, and hopefully that will lead to business growth now that there are not restrictions on operating, et cetera, I think. We've also seen in terms of potential opportunities, I've seen in the news a lot, and anecdotally, and also there's been a lot of research developing and articles coming out about how there is this movement of people from urban areas to rural areas across Canada. And obviously that's going to be different depending on the location. But I think that's a great opportunity for rural businesses potentially to harness new customers, new clients, new people moving into the area, we've seen that the housing market is quite turbulent right now, I guess, and increasing. So I think potentially harnessing new people who are coming into the area can be a really great way for businesses to move forward. We do see that in terms of teleworking, et cetera, that rural businesses are not anticipating that as much. We also see some, I think in the second quarter, there was a question about difficulty with hiring employees with the right skill sets, especially technological skill sets. That is a challenge for rural businesses. But, and I am speculating a little bit at this point, we don't have it shown in the data, but if there's a chance for rural areas to take advantage of potentially people who are looking to telework or move out, who have those tech skills, potentially maybe looking for employment in rural areas as opposed to working remotely in an urban area, that can potentially be an interesting finding in the future. But again, we also just see that there's still a lot of uncertainty there. So I think in the next couple months, we'll see more direct data and outputs that kind of show where businesses are heading. So I think we're still in the uncertainty phase a little bit, I think.
Mm-hmm. Haaris or Andrew, do you want to add anything to that?
Not at this time, yeah.
Okay. We're going to jump over to some of the questions that our participants have submitted. So Ray Bowman asks or comments that it's nice to see the ranking of challenges in terms of the percent of respondents reporting each challenge, such as rural versus urban or Ontario versus Canada. And I would suggest that you also ponder ranking the challenges by the rural intensity of reporting each challenge, such as calculating a location quotient to find which challenges are more or relatively important in rural compared to Ontario total or Canada total. Marina or Andrew, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I can make a quick comment on that. The outputs from the survey that we're currently producing every quarter are meant to be kind of a snapshot, and they're meant to be fairly short and snappy. And we know that there's a lot of data that will have some really interesting findings that we haven't been able to dig out yet. And so I think there's a lot of room for further, more in-depth analysis, either at Statistics Canada or by other data users who want to investigate the data. So I agree. There's ranking it by most common is one way to showcase which businesses are feeling those effects, but it's true, depending on your location, some of these challenges may not be as relevant, or again, the intensity, like you mentioned, it's a challenge, but is it going to sink your business? Maybe not. It might just be something that's annoying and ongoing and you just deal with. So that is a good concern. And we do hope to, as the rural kind of projects expand and develop, provide more in-depth analysis as well.
Yeah, well said. I think when it comes to data, sometimes you can have so much that it's hard to know exactly how to analyze all of it. There are so many ways that you can jump into it.
Lots of options, yeah.
And I will say, actually, as of the second quarter of 2021, we now have publicly available, I actually have the link down below, the data tables. They're now divided by rural, urban at the provincial level. So we now have more direct access to rural urban analysis for data users, and we'll continue to have that I guess category in the data tables moving forward. And if people are interested in doing some longitudinal analysis, et cetera, we can provide previous quarters as well if people are interested. So we hope that having that data moving forward for everyone to assess will definitely help improve some of the analysis that comes out of this.
Yeah, that's great to hear. I'm sure that a few of us at the Rural Ontario Institute will be eager to jump into that. Anne Tang also asked a question about how you define fully operational for businesses.
That's a good question. I'll have to look at the survey itself just to make sure I'm not missing any components. I believe that was mostly left up to survey respondents to decide what they thought of. Yeah. So in my sense, if someone responds fully operational, that means that they didn't have any constraints during that first part of the pandemic when the question was asked compared to before the pandemic. So they were able to continue operating as normally as possible. Obviously, maybe there were some changes to layout of the store or something like that, PPE, et cetera. But that is up to the survey respondents to kind of determine themselves. So for example, partially operational could be potentially if you can't have as many people in the store, employees in the store before you hit like maximum capacity limits that have been lowered, then you are able to operate, but maybe not with as many sales per hour as you used to have before with employees right next to each other and everyone able to kind of squish in a bit more. So that would kind of be my assessment of that.
Yeah, also perhaps like reduced hours, or and maybe businesses had to shut down for a while, say for a few weeks during the pandemic, and they could then reopen, after that. So that'll be like not fully operational again. But if they were able to remain like Marina said, fully operational, meaning like, like 9 to 5 or whatever their hours are, with full capacity, permitted. So that, but to some extent, it would be the interpretation of the business, I think. Yeah.
We have a question as well from Elaine, who asks, was there any information gathered as to the ownership of the businesses, e.g. whether they were owned by newcomers or immigrants?
I think we do, don't we?
I have to check about immigrants specifically. We do have a lot of, in the CSBC data tables, it is broken down by, I'll look up the categories right now just to list them off. But
there's some demographic variables like gender, I believe, is ethnicity one of them. It isn't an area we deal with so much because the more angles you look at it, the more degradation in the data quality that you see. So if we're looking at rural businesses, we discussed it a bit earlier that we couldn't look at rural Ontario by industry. If we were looking at rural and Ontario, then it's a trade-off. So since we're already looking at rural businesses in general, the other angles that you can look at this data aren't really an option for us. So it isn't something we're overly familiar with. But Marina, were you able to find anything?
Yeah, so I'm actually looking at the third quarter right now. I just pulled up the questionnaire, and the various demographic questions related to ownership include what percentage of this business is owned by women, what percentage of this business is owned by First Nations, Métis, or Inuit peoples, what percentage of this business or organization is owned by immigrants to Canada. So we can provide the immigrants to Canada, rural, urban, but there may be some data that's suppressed in that table. I don't know the numbers, but we do technically, that is a question that we ask, and we can categorize businesses. We also ask about persons with disability, percentage of business owned by LGBTQ2 individuals, and members of visible minorities. Yeah. So those are all the demographic categories of ownership that we currently assess.
So if that is of interest, I mean, we could look into, providing, some analysis of that, next time around, if that's something that, people here think that might be, of interest.
And there are other outputs on the survey that are not specifically related to rural and urban categorization as well. So for example, previously this month, there was, I wrote a paper or analysis with a colleague on ownership by visible minorities. And also there was another paper on, or other general analysis on the second quarter results as well. Oh, I think there was one on small businesses as well. So small businesses was the third one.
Great. On a similar note, there was a question about whether types of businesses were broken down within the survey. So in terms of whether they're a partnership or a sole proprietor or cooperatives, is that something that is in the data at the moment?
Yes. So it does ask what type of business. So it depends on the question. For example, if you are looking at ownership by visible minority, they only do it by private business. It is not including nonprofit and a couple other sectors, I believe. I think this is just because of the sample size issue, but I'm not 100% sure. I do know that they do exclude the nonprofit sector from that, but it can be categorized by government agency, private sector business, nonprofit organization, and it even classifies nonprofit by do you primarily serve households or individuals or businesses, and then an unknown, which I hope that section is low. Yeah.
This is really showing just how many different dimensions there are that can be taken into account on all of this.
We've focused on the rural lens, but we're not the only people looking at it. There's lots of different and interesting and insightful ways to look at the data.
We also have a question about whether there's been any analysis done between different provinces in terms of rural businesses. So whether, for instance, there's any analysis on rural Ontario versus rural Quebec.
At the moment, we have not provided any provincial analysis. Like I mentioned before, we've tried to kind of limit the scope of the articles that are coming out to not be huge analytical articles. So that was kind of a choice that was made to look at it by industry, because we felt that, especially for the second quarter, provincial analysis by rural urban dimensions is now available in the public data tables, whereas the industry level analysis is not. So we decided to focus on that for the time being. Potentially in the future, we may branch out into provincial and territorial analysis. I will say, just based on looking at it myself, sometimes we have seen some very interesting results, especially related to how different provinces especially have approached pandemic regulations. So there's definitely interesting information there, but unfortunately we haven't been able to flesh that out as much yet.
Right. Well, we have a couple of other questions that our team came up with, but we're a bit so that we don't miss anything. I do want to open up the floor in case there is anyone who would like to unmute and ask a question themselves. Okay. One question that we came up with was, as Marina had mentioned, rural businesses were more likely to remain fully operational according to the data that's been presented. And in the paper that informed some of this work, there's also a mention of how they were less likely to end up working remotely. In addition, you mentioned that they're less likely to engage in online sales to the same extent that urban businesses might. And so we were wondering, are there particular impacts that you think are likely to follow from this? And does this say anything about the need for broadband infrastructure within rural areas to support business development?
Absolutely. So I can answer that question. Marina, would you mind moving to the next slide? Since we knew this was coming, we prepared an additional table. This shows the percent from our first quarter results, the percent of businesses where teleworking is a possibility. We have Ontario and Canada, rural and urban, and we can see here that it is the rural-urban divide rather than a difference between Ontario and Canada. Urban businesses are almost twice as likely to, this is answering the first quarter, they were answering how is teleworking a possibility for their employees. And we can see that urban businesses responded saying that that it was a possibility at much higher rates than urban businesses did. In a second quarter kind of related question, discussing permanent changes inspired, or perhaps inspired isn't the right word, permanent changes as a consequence of the pandemic, only 6.3% of rural businesses said they were likely to offer 6.3 said they were somewhat or very likely to offer the opportunity to work remotely after the pandemic, compared to 14% of urban businesses. So again, over twice as many urban businesses. I will say that for this particular question, over 50% said that it was not a relevant question for it, which really emphasizes that for a lot of businesses, remote working is not either a short-term or long-term possibility for that. Although I do think it's relevant, and it's not something that this survey is particularly well suited towards, is that in general, larger businesses and organizations with like office jobs are better able to have remote working as an option. But this survey looks at each business individually. And so these numbers, looking at it on a labor side, I think would give you some different results, in that probably the number of people working remotely might be higher than the number of businesses, if that makes sense. So like a large financial institution, government institutions have been working remotely, that kind of thing. So we can see some signs, particularly between the rural and urban differences, but it's we're not particularly suited to give the best overview of working remotely. But the part about broadband is absolutely relevant for rural businesses. The CSBP, and particularly myself and Harris, are working directly on this project. We're developing an index of broadband accessibility for rural Canada, which will hopefully be available in the near future. From that work, we can say that only 30%, or approximately 30% of rural households currently have access to 50 megabit download and 10% upload, which is the standard for broadband that the Canadian Connectivity Strategy is stating as their long-term goal. And so that's broadband is measured at the household level rather than for industry, but the accessibility parallels very strongly, of course. And so we can, rural businesses definitely have a issue with accessing broadband standards, or broadband standards of 5010 compared to urban businesses. So there's a few different elements at play here. I hope that is kind of answers. I don't know if Harris, if you want to add anything to that.
No, I just thank you, Andrew. That's just for the broadband. I think like the 5010 is, as Andrew said, is the desired goal. It's not where broadband is defined. So I think the minimum broadband download speed is, I think, 1.5 megabits. So the percentage of rural areas that have that level of access
much higher. Yeah,
is much higher. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the index that we're developing is also looking at the access technology, like whether it's wired or fixed wireless or satellite. So there's a bit of distinction there. So when it comes out, we'll have all the metadata to go with it.
Yeah, great to know. And on that note, we also wanted to ask about next steps that Statistics Canada might have in terms of generating or analyzing or making data available to understand how COVID is impacting rural businesses. So are there any teasers or news that you can share with us at this point?
Yes, so I mean, so we've had some stakeholder consultations, and we plan to do some more down the road. What we've been hearing is like, users want granular data. They want data that's accessible, easily accessible, and easily found, discovered on the StatsCan website. And they want information about the pandemic, obviously. So we are kind of addressing those kind of areas at the moment. So, for example, we've developed some interactive visualizations. We are doing a few more of those interactive mapping applications to be able to geospatially visualize data for communities. We also are developing a rural data hub or portal where users can easily access, various analyses and data and visualizations that are rural related. So that should be coming live in the next few weeks. So in terms of the pandemic, we've released databases on the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy by rural and urban. And we have also done, we're looking at broadband, obviously. And this year, we're also going to be looking at some maybe housing in rural areas, and also potentially like the other two programs serve the emergency, Canada Emergency Response Benefit and the CEBA programs also. So those are potential things that we might look at, but there's no guarantee at this point. We are sort of evaluating the feasibility of those. Thanks.
That's all great to hear. Well, we're coming up at 2 p.m. So Lisselle, did you want to close us out?
Sure. Thank you, everybody. In RI, we believe that rural data is critical to better understand community issues, just as the one we discussed today, and make informed decisions. We would like to hear more from Statistics Canada. So here is an open invitation for you, Andrew, Haaris, and Marina, to share with rural stakeholders any future findings and relevant data that Statistics Canada develops in the future. There was already a discussion on potential topics. So if participants have some ideas on this, please connect with ROI and let us know what topic you would like to learn about. And thank you, everybody, for your time and for joining today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.